Rick Rowley, you directed the documentary Kingdom of Silence, which is about the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudi government. Now, the film tells that story in the larger context of sort of the U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship over the years and really over the decades. So it's a huge topic to tackle for a single film. Was it difficult to figure out exactly where you wanted to sort of get started and get, dip into it?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we started this film, we started as a murder investigation, right? And so we were looking at Jamal's murder, and we were doing the kind of things you do in that kind of investigation. We met with multiple intelligence agencies. We, reviewed some classified intel. We got insiders who knew stuff to talk to us, who'd never spoken before. But the deeper we dug, the clearer it became that the far more interesting question lay right below the surface. Not did the Saudi government, this crown prince, order the murder of Jamal Khashoggi? We know that he did, but why? Not how that gruesome murder was undertaken, but what was it about Jamal Khashoggi? Who was this man who was so dangerous that the kingdom would risk so much just to silence him? And so that story took us on a much longer journey that took us to Afghanistan, back to Saudi Arabia itself, all across Europe, Washington, to the halls of power. And Jamal's story, it's epic. It spans decades, it spans continents, but it carves this amazing arc through this pivotal moment in history that continues to shape our time today. Jamal lived his life at the center of a whirlwind. He was more than just a journalistic witness. He was an active participant in events that mark our time. He was a friend of bin Laden's, the first journalist to ever take a photograph of Osama bin Laden. He became an aide to the former head of Saudi intelligence. He was a chief spokesman for the kingdom after September 11th. He had a crucial role during the Arab Spring, and then when he finally broke with the kingdom after the horrors of the Saudi-backed counter-revolution against the Arab Spring, he was in the end exiled and then murdered by the princes he spent his life serving. So it was sprawling in terms of the sort of scope and the time it covered, but his central character arc was so clear and so poignant and moving. I mean, and that was our guide all the way through. I mean, it's a redemption story. Here's a man who, friend of bin Laden's, friend and aide to princes, who time and again sees his heroes, people who he's helped create, who he's defended and lionized in the press. He sees them turn into villains before his eyes, and he finds himself complicit in massive atrocities, from September 11th to the death of the Arab Spring, to the war in Yemen, and to his great credit, he's wounded by the things that he sees, and they change him. And in the very end, when he finally manages to break free at the age of 59, almost 60 years old, after spending a life inside the circles of power, reinvents himself and decides that the tortured contradictions of his life have become too stark and impossible to bear, and he had to take a stand. He took a stand, even knowing that it could cost him his life, and the princes killed him for it.
Hey Daniel, this is Keith. I'm sorry. Whoever is not on mute right now, can they please go
Everyone
on?
is on mute. It's Rick, the little microphone piece is rubbing against your...
Oh, it's rubbing against your shirt. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It sounds like somebody's slowly sanding.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
Yeah,
right.
So let's go back to the start of that question. Sorry about that.
Should I try it without this at all, or I think
you're fine if you just zip up a little bit.
Okay. Zip up under?
I don't know if it's a zip or whatever.
I think I'll open.
Yeah, that works.
Open good.
Cool.
Okay, I'll try to do that more concisely this time. Okay, so we began this film thinking that it was a murder mystery, and we were investigating a murder. And so we did the kind of investigative things you do in that situation. We met with multiple foreign intelligence agencies. We reviewed classified intel. We tracked down insiders who'd never spoken before. We found out new details about this gruesome killing. But the more we discovered, the clearer it became that the far more interesting question and story was just below the surface. Not did the Crown Prince order the murder of this journalist. We know he did, but why? Not how was this gruesome murder undertaken? We know that in granular detail, but who was this man who was so dangerous that the kingdom would risk so much to silence him? And so that story sent us on a much longer journey that ended up taking us thousands of miles around the world, from Afghanistan to Turkey to Riyadh and Jeddah to the halls of power in London and in Washington. And the story that we uncovered was, as you say, it was epic in scope. It spanned decades and it spanned continents. Jamal Khashoggi lived his life at the center of a whirlwind. He was more than just a journalistic observer, watching things happen. He was an active participant in events that continued to change our times. His career began as the first journalist to ever take a photograph of Osama bin Laden. He was a friend and champion of bin Laden when bin Laden was working for the CIA and Saudi intelligence to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. He went on to work with the former head of Saudi intelligence. He became a key spokesman for the kingdom after September 11th. He was traveling in the circles of power in this, toxic relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia up until the moment he died. So there was a lot of terrain to cover, but the arc that cleanly cuts through it and that was so compelling to us was Jamal's personal story of transformation. I mean, his story is a tragedy and it's horrific in many ways, but it also, to me, is a redemption story. I mean, Jamal's a man who begins, he time and again, he sees his heroes who he's helped create, who he's lionized and defended in the press, from bin Laden to the Saudi princes. He sees them turn into villains before his eyes, and he finds himself implicated in horrific global crimes. And to his great credit, he allows himself to be wounded by these moments and changed by them, and he becomes something else over the course of his life. He changes again and again. His life has all these distinct, fascinating chapters. And so finally, near the end of his life, after the Arab Spring, after he witnesses the government that he's served his entire life murder the hope of the Arab Spring in the streets of Cairo and elsewhere around the region, the contradictions become too much for him to bear, and he decides he has to take a stand, knowing full well the dangers that are involved in that. So at the age of 59, almost 60 years old, he reinvents himself as a critic of the regime. He decides that he has to stand on the right side of history, gives up his family, his job, everything he's ever known. And the princes he spent his life serving murder him for it.
And you mentioned this being a redemption story, and it seems kind of like the opposite when you look at the parallel track of the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia, where the things that America is complicit in is stuff that America has not repented for. Some of it is still ongoing. How much had you known going into this about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and how much was this film like a learning process for you as well? Kind of digging in deep into what this relationship has been over the years.
Yeah, well, one of the things that motivated me to want to make this film in the first place was that I spent around a decade as a war reporter covering, not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Yemen, Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, the other lesser known battlegrounds in the global war on terror. And a thing that was always striking, a thing that was acknowledged by every combatant on the ground, was that Saudi Arabia was a party to every single one of these wars, and it was a thing that was just not discussed or barely discussed inside the U.S. I mean, that this toxic relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has poisoned the region for generations, and that it continues to sow chaos and violence, not just around a region but around the world. So that was the thing that I was that anyone who has covered on the ground Iraq or Afghanistan or any of these other wars is intimately acquainted with the outsized role that Saudi and as a U.S. ally plays in the region. There were parts of this story that were sort of revelatory to me, though. One of the kind of most amazing moments in it for me was going back to Afghanistan which, you know, I've been to many times. I mean, I was a young reporter covering the war there, and I was traveled with one of Jamal's old comrades in arms, Abdullah Anas, who was a Mujahideen commander back in the day, and retraced his steps from the mountains down to Kabul when he followed the Mujahideen down. And, you know, to be there decades later, following in the steps of Jamal, who was 26, 27 years old during these years, the same roads that I had traveled, the same places I'd taken photographs, decades later, covering what is essentially the same war that he was covering then. You know, it really brought home the kind of both the human cost and the scale and time that of all this has taken. And, you know, really, I mean, we have meddled in the affairs of countries in the region for far too long. And there are some people who say, you know, now we need to make sure that we get rid of MBS from Saudi Arabia. And, you know, of course, it is not the United States' role to choose the next leader of Saudi Arabia or any other country. It is our responsibility, though, to decide what we're going to participate in as a country. I mean, and we are right now, we are a key essential partner in the war that Saudi is waging on Yemen, which is the biggest, humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. You know, thousands and thousands of children are starving to death because of the American bombs that are being rained on that country by Saudi Arabia. So it is beyond time that we as a nation re-examine our relationship with Saudi Arabia and our place in that part of the world.
And as part of the film, you interview a lot of government officials like John Brennan, former CIA director, Richard Clarke, Ali Soufan. Was there anyone who was reluctant to talk to you who is in the film, or anyone you wish wanted to talk to you who didn't want to be on the record for this film?
This film was an incredibly difficult film to make because most of the people who knew Jamal best were terrified to speak. I mean, it took us, more than a year to win the trust of the people who are closest to Jamal and get them to come and speak on camera. And so some of them have never before, spoken to anyone about his life and career. And so it's not just people in Saudi Arabia who are terrified for their personal safety and for the safety of their families. It's also, he was kind of a star in the media world, in the Arab media world. So a lot of people who knew him were reporters. And we talked to so many reporters, Arab reporters, in the Middle East, who were despondent that they couldn't speak to us. But all of the media, essentially, I mean, all of the satellite channels, with the exception of the ones that are based in Qatar, are owned by the royal family in whole or in part. Basically every newspaper that's published in the Arab world is owned in some way or another by parts of the Saudi royal family. So they knew that if they were going to speak out about what happened, they wouldn't have a career anymore. I mean, it would all be over. So there were lots of difficulties finding ways to convince people to speak with us, or making it safe for people to speak and work with us. A lot of people ended up speaking with us on background. A lot of secret meetings. I had to sneak into Saudi Arabia to do this. I wasn't granted a journalist visa, so I had to. I snuck in on a tourist visa with 2 little DSLR cameras filming kind of below the radar. I mean, it was full of challenges. I mean, on top of the fact that to tell this story properly, we had to go. We had to go all over the place. We had to go to Afghanistan, to Saudi, to everywhere.
And because Jamal Khashoggi was such a public figure, we see a lot of footage of him, and I'm sure you must have watched a lot of footage, much more even than we see in the film. That must be like an emotional kind of process, kind of knowing where his story ends and knowing, especially how brutal it was. What was it like, kind of reviewing his footage and sort of getting to know him in that sense?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not just the footage. I mean, it's in the end. I mean, the details we know and the transcripts we have of the last moments of his life are some of the most, chilling things that I've ever had to look through. And also Jamal was, he was one of our own. He was a journalist who was murdered by the regime that he criticized. And so that both, I think all of us as journalists, when one of our colleagues is murdered like that, we have a responsibility to do what we can to rescue what we can of their story from the silence that their killers would impose. But also, we all take risks like this sometimes. And we tell ourselves that they're worth it because the stories matter, and that things will change, and that people care, and that if something happens to us, that baton will be picked up by someone. And half the time we're lying to ourselves and the stories don't matter. So this I mean, it sounds in a way selfless to say we went to rescue the memory of our colleague, but it is also a selfish move, because we want to be reassured that that what we do is important enough to risk what we risk, and to put our families through the kind of fear and pain that they're put through. Because no one has our back, right? I mean, journalists are under attack all around the world. Turkey, Mexico, the United States itself, journalists are attacked, they're jailed, they're murdered. And who is there to guarantee that there won't be impunity for these crimes? Certainly not the government of the United States. Certainly not the government of any EU country. It is the community of journalists that protect and defend each other and that keep their stories alive when they come under attack and they're killed. And so that is, it's a complex emotional universe you sort of step into. You kind of see your friends who've already fallen because of this, and you see what could have happened if you'd taken a different turn on a road somewhere in Oruzgan province or whatever.
Congratulations on the film, and thank you so much for joining me to discuss it today. And we will bring you back for our closing segment a little bit later.
Thanks, Daniel.